Welcome to part 2 of my documentary about the complete history of the Loch Ness Monster. Part 1 covered the sightings, photos, and videos, and the first half of the searches. Today we pick right up where we left off with the rest of the searches and then the explanations on the monster's real identity before wrapping up with my final thoughts. Be sure to watch part 1 first and enjoy. Do you remember the Loch Ness gargoyle picture I told you about in part 1? Well, this is the individual that picture comes from. And it was an Operation Deep Scan that they found a tree stump that looked exactly like the gargoyle picture. And that picture on the very thumbnail of part 1 comes from the studies done by Rhines as well. But those two are just the tip of the iceberg. As you can see, there are a lot of studies with this guy's name on them, so this will be a longer section. So in researching this part, I discovered that there are multiple flipper photos. I showed one earlier in part 1, and that particular one is the more famous of the two, but here are both of them. As you can see, there's more than one of them. Then here is the gargoyle as well. Right, so now that you can see these, which I found in a March to April issue of Technology Review magazine covering the search for the monster from 1976, let's get to the facts. A lot of the info in the magazine is out of date, but it's linked below if you want to read it. But beyond the pictures, I'm not pulling much info from it. Instead, let's have a read of the Wikipedia page, shall we? Robert Rhines Studies, 1972, 1975, 2001, 2008. In 1972, a group of researchers from the Academy of Applied Science led by Robert H. Rhines conducted a search for the monster involving sonar examination of the loch depths for unusual activity. Rhines took precautions to avoid murky water with floating wood and peat. A submersible camera with a floodlight was deployed to record images below the surface. If Rhines detected anything on sonar, he turned the light on and took pictures. On August 8, Rhines's Raytheon DE-725C sonar unit, operating at a frequency of 200 kHz and anchored at a depth of 11 meters, 36 feet, identified a moving target, or targets, estimated by echo strength at 6 to 9 meters, 20 to 30 feet in length. Specialists from Raytheon were on hand to examine the data. P. Skitskiski of Raytheon suggested that the data indicated a 3-meter, 10-foot protuberance projecting from one of the echoes. According to author Roy McCall, the shape was a highly flexible, laterally flattened tail, or a misinterpreted return from two animals swimming together. Concurrent with the sonar readings, the floodlit camera obtained a pair of underwater photographs. Both depicted what appeared to be a rhomboid flipper, though skeptics have dismissed the images as depicting the bottom of the loch, air bubbles, a rock, or a fish fin. The apparent flipper was photographed in different positions, indicating movement. The first flipper photo is better known than the second, and both were enhanced and retouched from the original negatives. The photos were retouched to superimpose the flipper. The original enhancement showed a considerably less distinct object. No one is sure how the originals were altered. During a meeting with Tony Harmsworth and Adrian Shine at the Loch Ness Center and Exhibition, Rhines admitted that the flipper photo may have been retouched by a magazine editor. Another sonar contact was made, this time with two objects estimated to be 9 meters, 30 feet. The strobe camera photographed two large objects surrounded by a flurry of bubbles. Some interpreted the objects as two plesiosaur-like animals, suggesting several large animals living in Loch Ness. This photograph has rarely been published. A second search was conducted by Rhines in 1975. Some of the photographs, despite their obviously murky quality and lack of concurrent sonar readings, did indeed seem to show an unknown animal in various positions and lightings. One photograph appeared to show the head, neck, and upper torso of a plesiosaur-like animal, but skeptics argue the object is a log due to the lump in its chest area, the mass of sediment in the full photo, and the object's log-like skin texture. Another photograph seemed to depict a horned gargoyle head consistent with that of some other sightings of the monster. However, skeptics point out that a tree stump was later filmed during Operation Deep Scan in 1987, which bore a striking resemblance to the gargoyle head. In 2001, Rhines's Academy of Applied Science videotaped a V-shaped wake traversing still water on a calm day. The Academy also videotaped an object on the floor of the loch resembling a carcass, and found marine clamshells and a fungus-like organism not normally found in freshwater lochs, a suggested connection to the sea and a possible entry for the creature. In 2008, Rhines theorized that the creature may have become extinct, citing the lack of significant sonar readings and a decline in eyewitness accounts. He undertook a final expedition, using sonar and an underwater camera in an attempt to find the carcass. Rhines believed that the animals may have failed to adapt to temperature changes resulting from global warming. So yeah, that was a lot of information I just threw at you, so we'll carry on now. I'm not going to read from the Wikipedia page of any more of these. I just felt that since there was so much about this one topic, it was best to just make sure I covered all the information. We'll move on now, but one thing I want you to keep in mind is the theory Rhines put forth that the monster was a living animal that had since become extinct, because we will revisit that in the explanations section. Okay, so we're going to follow that super long section up with a super short one because I could not find much information about this documentary online. But this was a BBC production that conducted a search of the loch using 600 sonar beams, along with satellite tracking from orbit. Resolution was so high that it could pick up a small buoy out on the loch. But this time no kaiju-sized Dunkleosteus were spotted. In fact, no animal of substantial size was found anywhere in the loch. Though many of the scientists involved have been openly hopeful of finding something, the conclusion they collectively drew was that the study proved the monster was a myth. The documentary aired on BBC One in 2003. Alright, I've alluded to this one a lot, now let's actually talk about it and cover the details about this survey. In the interest of time, this study's research and findings will be summarized, but more of it will be covered in the next section, as it ruled many suspected animals out as being a cause for the monster. The study itself was done in 2018, and itself was a DNA study of the loch with the goal of searching for unusual species. Though the study was done in 2018, the results were not published until 2019. After the information in the study was researched and the results were determined, it was found that no DNA of large fish, including sharks, sturgeons, or catfish, could be found. There was also no otter or seal DNA found, though eel DNA was found in abundance among the samples that had been gathered. And eels of extreme size could not be ruled out, which has led many since the study was done to conclude that eels were likely to be one of the most likely explanations for the non-hoax sightings of the monster throughout the years. It should be noted that no large eels have ever been caught in the loch, though that doesn't rule out their existence necessarily. The study did, however, utterly debunk the idea that the monster was a plesiosaur or similar prehistoric aquatic reptile, as no evidence for any animal like that at all was found. The study's leader, Professor Neil Gemmell, said, quote, "So, I think we can be fairly sure that there is probably not a giant scaly reptile swimming around in Loch Ness." With that, most of the expeditions to find the monster have been covered. Smaller ones or single individual persons have also searched for the monster over the decades, but many of these would have been redundant to cover, and anything of note from some of these have been covered in the sightings already. Moving on, now the explanations of what the Loch Ness Monster really was will be covered. When photography became a widespread thing, it's obvious that intentional hoaxes about the monster increased. The surgeon's photo, the Loch Ness Muppet, and the flipper photo all fall into the category. And these, and more like them, can all be debunked as any actual evidence for the monster's existence. But what about the eyewitness testimonies from the 30s and before? Sure, that form of evidence is the weakest there is. There's no proof beyond someone saying they saw something. But here's a question to ask. Were those all fake stories? Or did people actually see something around the loch? If they did, what did they actually see? Let's look into some of the possible answers in this section covering explanations. Nessie is something that truly captures our imagination, and maybe part of us all hope that these mysterious beasts could in fact exist. But looking at all that we've examined so far, let's look into what Nessie might in fact really be. As incredible as it would be, it's not a plesiosaur. So what is the Loch Ness Monster? One theory is that Nessie is in fact a giant eel, or just a group of eels. The eDNA study that we covered in the last section ruled out a Greenland shark, large catfish, or prehistoric aquatic reptile definitively. But what about groups of small or even possibly giant eels? Eels were found to be among the 500 million DNA sequences analyzed. Professor Neil Gemmell had this to say on the topic. Well, our data doesn't reveal their size, but the sheer quantity of the material says that we can't discount the possibility that there may be giant eels in Loch Ness. Therefore, we can't discount the possibility that what people see and believe is the Loch Ness Monster might be a giant eel. Unquote. There's a lot of eels in the loch, and eelvers, juvenile eels, arrive in the region as well, along with the River Ness, after migrating 3,100 miles. Many consider the large eels or a group of them swimming near the surface a likely explanation for some sightings of the monster. This is a likely one, as was mentioned, the eDNA study ruled out large Greenland shark, which was also thought to be an explanation. With large sharks and extinct marine reptiles definitively ruled out, many scientists agreed that eels might be behind many of the sightings throughout history. An eel, be it a large one or a group of them, would certainly fit the wriggling and churning up the water description we heard a while ago. Yeah, this is a serious theory some propose as an explanation to the monster sightings. As bizarre as it sounds at first, it's actually a very simple explanation. If you look at the picture on screen, you can see that the artist shows how a swimming elephant could create the shape of Nessie. One, Dr. Neil Clark, who said that the monster might be floating logs or waves, offered up the theory that says circus elephants being allowed to swim between shows as a means of relaxing between shows could explain sightings of Nessie, as during the 1930s circuses were common in the area, and they were known for allowing their animals to swim as a means of rest. The idea certainly has appeal, and it is very likely that people could have seen some large animals like elephants swimming in the loch and not recognize them for what they were. And the art on screen shows how it might have appeared like something else entirely than it was. It's just something to think about. Well, this is much less exciting than a plesiosaur. Don't worry, we'll get to that one. But this is a theory about what the monster could be nonetheless. Outside of the hoax photos, what are some of the things people have legitimately seen in the loch, and they thought could have been a massive beast in the water? This might be one of them. There's not much to really comment on this one, but large, potentially submerged logs could certainly give the illusion of a large animal just under the surface of the water. And the article I read reviewing this theory shows a picture of a tree branch that does have a general shape of a plesiosaur or serpentine animal. I personally would not be surprised if some of the sightings were in fact large logs that washed into and drifted around the loch. The trees and forests around the loch have been referred to as a, quote, Nessie spawning ground. In the case of this theory, that might be literal. The 2016 photograph proved this one as a possible explanation. Have a look at it again. Some people legitimately thought this image was proof of the monster when it shows nothing but 3 seals swimming in a line, creating the general illusion of a long body with humps. Seals swim in lines often, and as they are known to exist in the loch, someone seeing them swimming in a line from a distance could very well mistake them for a large serpentine creature. But again, this photo isn't proof. Even at times when the loch surface is calm with no substantial wind or boat, wakes have still been sighted and reported. Why? One theory for the cause of these wakes, which have been associated with the Loch Ness Monster by some, is that they were nearly bird wakes. Bartender David Moreau reported a wake he believed was a creature zigzagging, diving, and reappearing, and overall not conforming to the V shape a boat wake would make. 26 other people at a nearby car park also reported seeing the same thing as well. The consensus is that this was merely a misidentification of a bird wake, and bird wakes have been seen as an explanation for other sightings of initially unexpected wakes in the loch before. Here is one that certainly could explain some sightings. Again, a tree just under the water, floating near the surface, might look like a large animal just under the surface of the water. This is an example of an optical illusion. It should be noted as well that wind conditions can give a choppy appearance to the water, with calm patches appearing dark from the shore, because this section would still reflect the surrounding mountains. In 1979, W.H. Lynn showed that atmospheric refraction could distort the shape and size of objects and animals, and to further prove his point, in 1979 he published a picture that he took on Lake Winnipeg, a large but shallow lake in Canada. The picture itself showed a rock under the effects of atmospheric mirage that resembled a head and neck. The image was shared in the 1981 issue of Nature magazine in an article titled "The Norse Mermaid as an Optical Illusion Phenomena." This is an interesting one. If you've never seen seismic gases erupt to the surface from a lake bottom, it creates a large disturbance in the water that could easily be confused with a large animal breaching and splashing at the surface. With that in mind, let's examine the evidence for this being a cause of some of the sightings. Italian geologist Luigi Picardi has proposed geological explanations for ancient legends and myths, noting that in the earliest recorded sighting of the creature, the dubious at best life of Saint Columba, the creature first appeared with a Latin I can't pronounce, but I'll try. Cum ingenti fermentu. I bet I butchered that, so here it is in English. Quote, "A loud roaring. The loch is on a fault line, and an earthquake releasing seismic gases, which then rose to the surface, could be an explanation for something swimming at the surface of the loch." Or perhaps more appropriately, the appearance of something swimming at the surface of the loch. Boat wakes have been mentioned a few times. The Dinsdale film is thought to possibly show a boat traveling across the surface of the loch. Boats leave a V shape in the water that is very recognizable. It can even be found in satellite images easily enough, and they can give the illusion of a large, usually serpentine animal swimming. In part 1, I mentioned a picture that compared the Dunkleosteus-like boat wake to others, and here is that picture. So, now that we can see boat wakes can create the shape of a large animal, what about seiches? A seich is a temporary disturbance in the water level of an enclosed body of water, to put it very simply, and they cause waves which could give the illusion of a large creature being under the water. Earlier, it was mentioned that the loch is on a fault line, but earthquakes in the region are too weak to cause seiches, but powerful earthquakes far away could cause them, such as the 1755 Lisbon earthquake in Africa. Earthquakes can and have affected bodies of water thousands of miles away before. For example, reverberations from an earthquake in Mexico sent a tsunami through an underground cave and up through the Devil's Hole cave in Nevada, several thousand miles away. So it is possible that something similar could occasionally occur within Loch Ness as well. Whales, catfish, otters, long-necked newts, large invertebrates like bristleworms, and swimming deer have all been cited as other possible explanations for what people have seen in the water. No matter which one you subscribe to, though, most agree the sightings of the monster have never been anything more than outright hoaxes, sightings of mundane objects, and mere wishful thinking. Well, I can't end on such a depressing notion, so here's some of the fun explanations. I like this idea in principle, the idea that, a century ago, a massive beast indeed swam in the loch and was seen, the last of its kind that has since died out. It's a neat idea, and if the remains sunk to the bottom, they might be lost forever. But what does the theory itself say? Returning to Robert Rines once again, he put forth the theory that the Loch Ness Monster could be an unknown animal whose horns from some sightings function as nostrils, allowing it to breathe without breaking the surface. Perhaps an animal that either evolved from a plesiosaur directly or by convergent evolution. But the specific theory I want to focus on is the one he put out in 2008, which states that the creature may have gone extinct since the first sightings of it, with the lack of sonar readings being cited as an example, along with the decline in eyewitness accounts of sightings. Following this, he set out on an expedition with the camera and sonar to find the carcass on the loch floor. Ryan cited global warming as a possible cause for the animal's extinction. Let's entertain the plesiosaur notion, even if it's impossible. Not only because these animals have been extinct since the KT mass extinction 65 million years ago, but also because the eDNA study ruled this one out as well, definitively. But as this is the most famous theory about the monster, I have to dive into it. Could a plesiosaur survive in the cold waters of the loch for all this time? There's a lot going against this theory as a whole. I'd love if it was true. I'm a paleo fanatic, but I'm not going to claim it's true just because I want it to be. So let's actually have a look at this and go through the facts. As I mentioned a while ago, the loch is only a few thousand years old, and the plesiosaur went extinct 65 million years ago. And unlike the much older and much longer extinct Dunkleosteus, which sure, one of those could maybe stay hidden all this time if it was in the loch, again, it's not, a plesiosaur would have to surface multiple times a day for air. It's not a fish like the placoderm. It's a reptile that breathes air, meaning it would have to come up, again, multiple times a day rather than staying under the water all the time. In addition to that, Leslie No of the Sedgwick Museum in Cambridge said in 2006 that the osteology of the neck makes it absolutely certain that the plesiosaur could not lift its head up, swan-like, out of the water. In addition to the eDNA study definitively ruling out any possibilities of there being a reptile like a plesiosaur in the loch, along with the fact that if it was a reptile, it would be seen often when it needed to breathe, even if it had survived the KT extinction, and the fact that this theory only became popular after the hoaxed surgeon's photo, the plesiosaur theory can perhaps be the easiest theory to rule out as an explanation for the Loch Ness Monster's identity. Lake monsters capture the imagination, and they're an incredibly common cryptid. They appear all around the world, heck, my home state of Indiana even has one. No other monster story proves this notion more so than Nessie, though. America has Bigfoot, and Europe has Nessie, and no other cryptid than Bigfoot has captured people's imagination. Anyway, this video was the most in-depth I've ever researched about Nessie. I mean, I knew a lot beforehand, but I found a lot of information and people and stories I'd never heard of, and I really wanted to give each story the justice it deserves. There's so much depth here, and I did my best to cover it. I sat down to cover every story and every search, and I think I got most of it. You know, I'd love to say I got it all, but I honestly just don't know. And if I did make any mistakes about certain things, then please feel free to let me know where they were. You know, I'm one guy doing all this research, and some of this stuff is obscure and kind of hard to find details on. I know one error I had, the 1932 sighting, that I talked about in part 1, I'm pretty sure that account was only made public in 1990. So, did it actually occur in 1932? If it occurred at all, is up in the air. That was one thing that I think I got wrong that I noticed while editing and stuff. And I wanted to, acknowledge that here, just like how in part 1 I called St. Columbia on accident. Again, that's an error, and I acknowledge that. I really did do my best to get it all right, though. And I'm one guy, and a mistake about a specific detail can slip by anyone sometimes. With all that covered, the stories, the evidence, and what-ifs, the history of the Loch Ness Monster has been told, and it's time for me to ramble about it and give you my own personal thoughts. Again, I tried to tell the whole history here, and heck, I even covered stuff that generally isn't believed to be connected to the Loch Ness Monster, like the St. Columba story, which can almost be guaranteed as being false, and there's just some stuff that I missed, but I covered as much as I could find. I wanted to do this for a while, and I finally decided to just actually write, record, and edit this whole thing. It took forever. I understand now why some YouTubers who make this kind of content exclusively usually are months or at the very least weeks between uploads. This took me forever to do. But I might make more documentaries in the future because I enjoyed doing all the research. And I'm not just going to limit myself to cryptozoology, because there's a lot of cool history I could write about, and even prehistory stuff too. Topics I know I'd like to cover at some point, if I'm able, include Bigfoot, the fauna about the Cretaceous era, and even the Lost Franklin expedition, the evolution of early human species like Habilis, the mystery of the Mary Celeste. There is so much good stuff to make documentaries on. And you can find any topic you want to research. It's incredible. There's so much history and so many just cool things out there. In a few months, when I want to commit myself to doing this much recording, editing, and research again, I think I'm going to do the fauna of the Cretaceous. Because the Cretaceous, obviously, is dinosaurs and all that, but the amount of animals that existed at that time is just incredibly diverse, even outside of dinosaurs. So I think it would be a fascinating era to cover. I need to be clear on one thing, though. If you're someone who's subscribed because you like this kind of content, documentaries like this will not be a frequent thing. I'm fine with doing it about topics I find interesting every few months or so, when I want to commit to this much effort to one video project, but this isn't my usual format, If you subscribe for this kind of content, I don't want to disappoint you, so I want to be very clear, this is not the kind of content I typically make. I think I will make it more so in the future, but it's not going to be, every kind of video I put out. This video as a whole was an experiment of something different, and I ended up enjoying it enough. So if you did enjoy this new documentary style video and you're fine with, multi-months between each one, then, please feel free to stick around, because it definitely won't be a one-off. As much as it took, I enjoyed the research so much that, doing a video like this gives me a chance to research topics I want to learn more about. Lately, I've found I've enjoyed making audio-based content probably the most out of every kind of video I do. I do a lot of different types of videos, but this style and format I just really enjoyed a ton. I make audiobook narrations from my original stories and books fairly regularly, but no matter the video, I put a lot of effort into all of them. And I recently bought a new laptop, which gives me an even wider range of stuff I can do. My audiobook videos, though, are ones I'm very proud of, because those are stories which are entirely my own. Obviously, telling your own creation feels different than telling history, like I did here. And if I make more documentaries, then I'm sure my style will evolve. Again, this whole Loch Ness Monster history video was just a big experiment, especially with this format and editing style. And when I started editing this, well, I guess technically part 1, the format I was doing was pretty close to how I edit my audiobook content, and then it kind of branched into its own different style. It just became its own thing, and in a different style than my audiobook content, which is all from books I've been working on since summer 2021. Also, during this research, getting a little bit back more on topic, I found a magazine from the mid 1970s, a time well before the internet, and the fact I was able to find a fully scanned and archived copy of it online was just cool. You know, I really just found an appreciation for that and all the knowledge that exists online. The fact that I could pull up something online like that and read it, in full right away, and it just makes me appreciate the fact that I live in this age of connection and opportunity. I just got that feeling of appreciation that it's all instantly available that I never really thought of before. A fully scanned magazine from the late 1970s that hardly anyone likely remembers, or even a random letter from 1938. All of that is on the internet, and you can find and read it instantly. And even more extreme, I can find a literal book from 565 AD on the internet in full and read it. That's from a time when those who read it back then couldn't comprehend the idea of the internet being possible. There's so much information and texts instantly available. I grew up in the time right after the internet became a widespread thing, so I've always had any information available right away. But seeing that old magazine in particular, fully available, just gave me appreciation for that fact when I don't think I ever really had it before. Seeing that for some reason just hit me with the fact that, in a way I can't describe, but gave me a new sense of appreciation for how much information we have available in this time, and it lets me have the opportunity to make stuff like this and learn all this stuff. It's very cool. Back to Nessie. Personally, I love my own theory that Nessie is actually a Dunkleosteus, and you can't tell me it's not. That's my headcanon. In all seriousness, I've always enjoyed the myth of the Loch Ness Monster. As a kid, I loved Scooby-Doo and the Loch Ness Monster a lot, and that movie and some books at my old elementary school are my earliest memories of the Loch Ness Monster. And I remember this one book at the elementary school that had most of the famous pictures we looked at in it, but it didn't even try to debunk them. you know, I remember the flipper photo, it actually was hyping up the idea that it was a plesiosaur. Very much misinformation. I do not remember what that one was called, but I remember that vividly. I remember that caption very vividly. All that said, actually doing all this research and reading all these stories, I think it showed why and how Nessie captured the world's imagination, and I'm glad the legend exists. The idea that there's something like this incredible beast in our modern world where so many people see things as mundane is just cool. It's an embodiment of this idea that there is still mystery and unknown in the world. And I think that we as humans just find the idea of these monstrous, incredible beasts from a bygone age still living in hidden areas of the world to just be appealing and inspiring. Maybe because it makes the world seem like it's just a little bit bigger. The grand days of exploration are all long gone. The maps are filled, and they have been for our whole lives, but Nessie and stories like that are a little piece of the unknown that still hang on and give us that thrill that people exploring and making those maps centuries ago probably felt. And I love that. I actually buy into the wishful thinking exploration because this exact feeling I just described that monsters or mysteries, like this give us. Or exploration, I'm sorry. The wishful thinking explanation. I misspoke right there. But the point still stands. I buy into the wishful thinking explanation because, it gives you that feeling that I was just describing, And just like how I never really appreciated, the wealth of knowledge that's on the internet, I never really appreciated the legend of the Loch Ness Monster until now. I thought it was neat and interesting, but, I didn't ever deep dive into it. I didn't appreciate what it represents. Nessie is the perfect example of the mystery that captures our imagination. And even though it was never a plesiosaur, the fact modern studies and searches have shown that people might have really seen something, such as massive eels, proves once again that there is some truth in old myths. Perhaps in some way Nessie really does exist, just not in the form we always thought. But since there is some truth to the story, we can appreciate together that this legend really does have some truth to it. And, in some indirect way, the Loch Ness Monster was always real. And that idea is just really cool, and it makes you wonder what grains of truth are in other cryptids, like the Yeti, Bigfoot, the Himalayan zombies, and all these other incredible old stories of monsters that capture our imagination in the same way. On that thought-provoking note, I wrap up this documentary of the Loch Ness Monster, having told its history, and I leave you with the story, evidence, and able to decide on what you think the Loch Ness Monster was, or maybe still is. I don't want to tell you what to think. Sure, I was blunt in saying that a lot of the photos that people say are good evidence really aren't. But that's because I was talking the facts of everything. And heck, if you want to hang in the it's a plesiosaur, if you want to hang in the it's a plesiosaur camp, all the power to you. Or if you're in the camp that it never existed, or in the giant eels camp, or the elephant camp, or the Team Dunkleosteus camp with me, we're all fans of the story, and we're captivated by the history and the stories and the what ifs. People might have their own ideas on what Nessie is, but it's an idea that can bring different people to one group to talk about and enjoy together, and that's really cool. What do I actually think Nessie is? I might love my own idea of a Dunkleosteus, but that fish is the embodiment of badass, but it's also the perfect example of what I was saying earlier about there being unknown still in the world, and when there's not mystery like there was even a century ago. But personally, I don't think Nessie was ever one specific thing. I think a bunch of animals and inanimate objects were seen throughout the years that became part of the legend by association. There was a time when if someone saw anything that they couldn't explain in the loch, it was immediately, it's the monster. Basically, Nessie was a mixed up, mashed mess of different things people associated with the monster. That's the theory I buy into, that it was a little bit of everything. I'd say my biggest suspect was eels, as well as seals and other animals that live in the loch, and even inanimate objects that you can find, like waves and logs. But it's still fun to think, what if? So, with all of that being said, and the history having been told, thank you for watching.